There has been intense debate over the origins of crop circles. Where do they come from? Who is responsible? Do they contain a secret message? There are some who believe that they are the work of extraterrestrials, and there are some who maintain that the formations are a natural phenomena. Whatever, no one can doubt their splendor or wonder at the intricate designs. Crop circles have captured the imagination of man as far back as records began. There have been many attempts to reproduce the geometrically complex designs without success. Remarkably, certain formations have appeared within one night. The short amount of time, the geometric complexity, and the methods of bending and weaving the corn stems are clearly beyond human capabilities. The designs themselves are not the whole story. Research has shown that biological changes take place in the corn at a cellular level, and speculation about the causes includes electromagnetic forces, microwave energy, and sound waves. These, together with the mysterious lights, eyewitness accounts, reports of malfunctioning electronic equipment, and positive health effects on people visiting circles, suggest that the phenomenon involves unexplained forces. These images are a testament to a phenomenon which is far beyond the understanding of man, a phenomenon which poses no threat but may hold the key to some of the greatest mysteries of the universe.
Well, I guess you don't need to know too much about myself. I am an electrical engineer by profession, senior officer in local government. I went into local government on the reorganisation of local government in Great Britain back in 1974, and grew through a number of posts, and fortunate to be experiencing promotions about every 6 months or so. My position looked pretty good. It was looking pretty rosy. And then I saw 5 circles in a field, and something threw a switch. From that time on, of course, I became more and more involved. I wasn't aware at the time that I walked into that field that I was to become, within hours, one of only 3 people in the world researching the phenomena. I joined forces within days of that July day in 1983 with Dr. Terence Meaden, who was and still is the head of the Tornado and Storm Research Organisation in Great Britain, and Pat Delgado, who had just retired from his input into NASA tracking the Mariner project at the Woomera tracking ranges in Australia. Pat, who is a close friend and now co-author, is an electrical mechanical design engineer, really not so far away from my own profession. And so the 3 of us undertook a research project to try and discover how these patterns, which were then relatively simple, were appearing in this area, approximately 40 miles radius of Stonehenge in southern England. And that, of course, is where I lived at that time. The outcome of the provision of 3 reports from me, and this is early mid-80s, remember, was an announcement in the British government, House of Commons, that they accepted there was a real phenomena. There's something the media haven't picked up on too. Recorded in Hansard 5 times, and in recent weeks other developments which we will talk about. The British government themselves saying there is a genuine phenomenon. There's a core phenomenon here. The explanation, though, that I have to be again totally upfront with, not acceptable to me, but I of course have to tell you that the British government's view is that the phenomenon is not a mystery at all. It's very unusual, but it isn't a mystery. These are being caused by a new kind of whirlwind, a new meteorological phenomenon, one popularly now referred to as a plasma vortex. This is a rotating field of electrified air, which during nighttime accounts for the golden balls of light people are seeing, the UFO. It accounts for that. It also is responsible for dropping into the field of cereal crop and causing a circle. Well, at a push, and I've spoken to most of the leading meteorologists, including, of course, Terence Meaden, who we were working with in Europe, and since Professor Snow and other people here, and they find it hard to imagine that that kind of phenomena could even cause a single crop circle because of the well-defined cut-off edges, the lack of damage, no evidence that that kind of plasma, ball lightning basically, could cause an effect of that kind. How about the sizes? Well, those that I doubt if you've seen, unless you're following the research itself, the smallest are these guys here, actually a little smaller, 12 inches to 18 inches, we do have some. But they're this category of circle, which is not particularly exciting. It's not going to hit your national newspaper or even the books on the phenomena or the research, because they're really not dramatic. But it's the same phenomena. There were hundreds of these appearing in the landscape when the matter was taken to the British government. These were appearing not only in the public areas, they were appearing in the military areas. They were appearing on Salisbury Plain, for anybody who's visited the area, which is an exclusion zone. You are not permitted to overfly it, let alone drive through it. It's surveyed from the air on satellites. It's a very secure area. This phenomena is appearing inside there. This circle here, of course, could be gained access for its construction by these tractor tire marks. And you're going to see a lot of these tractor tire marks. These do provide access points. Since 1980 in Europe, they have. The system of sowing the seed and then fertilizing, running down the same tractor tire mark throughout the growing period is what that's all about. They didn't use the system before 1980, and when the farmers discovered the circles before 80, they were saying, the media, the government can say what they like. There were no tracks in or out of the circles we found. Nobody had been there. When they walk away and we arrive on the scene, invariably there's one. And it's the track of the farmer that found it. These are oilseed rape plants, bent into position in a circle approximately 70 feet in diameter. And what you'd find, if you lifted those surface plants and had a look underneath, it's a whole different story. Those plants are lying along two overlaid sine waves, like this, out of phase, breaking away into the center. Remember, that's what's under each one of these, on the peak of a single sine wave running underneath here. Peak, trough, etc. Highly complex. Not always are the plants spiraled. Sometimes it's like a radial firework airburst, straight out from the center to the periphery. And what we are calling an S-type pattern, because of course they are laid along an S-type wave like this, with a tendency to reverse in the center and just on the periphery itself. This is a ripened plant like the thousands that are in those crop circles, and they're not knuckled. They're not bent. It's as if they're made supple throughout the construction phase, that period of construction, and then hardened up again. The oilseed rape plant, which is indeed a brittle plant, which is an example of here, very positively will not only knuckle, it will snap off. It will separate because it's brittle when you push it over beyond an angle of about 45 degrees. That's the starch crystal under microscope of the plants involved. The lattice structure, very different to everything and anything they had ever seen before, was as the days passed, the structure hardened and tightened as this is from the circumference towards the center, returning to this about 2 weeks later. So there was some residual effect which clearly was still moving, onward going, changing the lattice structure of the crystal itself. These plants are more healthy than the plants that are growing or in the circumference in the field that's totally unaffected. These plants are vigorous, they have growth, they have colour, they have healthy hair, as it were. They have bounce, and they're not damaged. There's something different about these plants. Much more significant is the fact that the grain taken from, say, last year's crop circle in the US, in Canada, in Australia, in England, in Australia, wherever they come from, and they've been tested, the grain is germinating up to a maximum of 40% faster than the stock they came from. They are growing more extensively than the stock they came from the controls. The root structure is more extensive. It's more healthy than the plant stock they came from. The suggestion at this point, that is incidentally, a change at the cellular anatomic level in the plants themselves. That is an effect which cannot be replicated, we are told, by the most eminent biophysicist in this country, by human feet, ropes and chains. The nearest we can even replicate that effect is by low levels of microwave radiation. That indeed an increase in internal temperature, albeit for a short period of time, probably only 15 seconds, and we'll come back to that, is causing these expulsion cavities where the interior elements, moisture, liquid, and cell structure too, is actually ejected from the plants at the nodal points, just here. Suggested by Dr. Levengood and others, John Burks and so on, and indeed Dr. I think Utsuki in Japan and Meaden also in England, that there is an increase in internal temperature. There is a process in the early phase of that 15 seconds where the plants are made supple, they are bent, the artistry is completed, and then hardened. So that when those plants that are now bent without breaking or knuckling, we attempt to lift up, they do break off, like carrots, like celery. And they are undamaged. Well, the sizes of the circles, the smallest being, as you've seen, and that's pretty well as small as they come, to the very largest, and that's what you're looking at now, just about to pop up onto the ceiling. This guy appeared on one of the shortest nights of 2 summers ago at a place called Lambourne, and it was half a mile across. Appeared overnight, and there was just 5 hours of darkness alongside this road here. The farmer that owned it saw, as he always does, as his farmhouse is over here, just up off the picture. He's convinced nothing in there at 10:30 as the sun dropped down. 5 o'clock in the morning when they're out inspecting their crops and checking for when they're going to harvest, as they do, they take the humidity and all the rest of it. They know what's in their fields. Bang, it's there. In my experience with the British Army when we were experimenting with the Gazelle helicopters and personnel in attempting to construct these things with the help of the British Army, 2 men would take approximately 1.5 hours to construct a 70-foot circle. Can you imagine the army of people, and well organized, with all the necessary layout equipment, and in 5 hours only, and without causing damage or changes at the molecular structure of the plants, put a circle, a pattern, half a mile across in a field? I doubt it. Well, the history, 1678. The writing that goes with this is a wood carving, a wood cutting, says that the farmer and people in this little hamlet witnessed the devil appearing in a chariot of fire, in a ball of light, remember that, appearing from the sky and cutting his oats into a crop circle. Well, circumstantial, but it's there. We have 2 other references in the late 1600s that are extremely similar. 1923, 24, and 25, a farmer farming Cheesefoot Head in southern England, the very same field as I saw a cross formed by 5 circles in 1983, the same field. After watching a television program I did in England, I think for BBC television at the time, he wrote a letter, and it reached us through the BBC, saying, I had those circles in my field in 1923, 4, and 5. He wasn't the first to step forward. We had many farmers saying, this goes back many years. We had them in the same fields, and here you've got now one of the correlations in the data. This is not random. We have not put our fingers on the total formula here, of course, at this point, but there's something important about the locations. This isn't your ET or flying saucer hitting a field, an animal mutilation, and on. It's something different, because the same fields are revisited time and time and time again. Only in 3 cases that I can tell you of are they on the same identical spot. If it always occurred, we'd have been digging years ago. Not so. Large one over here this year, small one over there next. Quintuplet here, and so on, so on, so on. But the location clearly is important, and we haven't discovered why. Although they're frequently very close to water, extremely frequently, we're looking at about a 90% correlation. And the vast majority of patterns appearing worldwide are within 40 miles of Stonehenge. They are conglomerated as it were, focused upon that same area, as we have the highest level of circular archaeological sites in the same location, and within a few centimetres to the same dimensions. So 1946, near Salisbury, southern England, there were more reports of the phenomena. 1966 at Tully, Queensland, Australia. And 1976, big time, it hit southern England and has continued without stop since that time. They're appearing in sand in Australia. One case, I believe, Oregon last year, which we're still gathering data on, is an impressive array of concentric rings in this country in sand, and indeed in snow in Afghanistan, Turkey. And if this is the same phenomena, and we will talk about this, here on the Charles River in Boston, appeared last winter in January, a photograph taken by Donna Coveney from MIT and supplied to us through Doug Rogers of CCCS. A photograph taken from the university, a series, tens of concentric rings connected by pathways, boxways, on ice which was so thin that it simply would not support the weight of even the smallest child. It isn't somebody running about here that has caused this. Appearing in 2 forms of vegetation, green wheat and yellow, beautiful yellow flowers and brittle plants, oil seed rape. They're appearing in trees. We've had them in 2 cases only. Remember, we're looking at a database of about 4,500 reports, 2,500 that I've personally visited and personally investigated. But we have had 2 reports, and it's worth putting them to you, in mature conifer trees. One being in Wisconsin, and the second in the same year of 1981, at a place where circles have been appearing for many years, same slot, bang dead center in a band of trees running along an old Roman road. They appear on the next photograph in the rice paddy fields as this phenomenon grabbed a hold of Japan back about 6 years ago. The farmers and the people discovering them were saying, as everybody else has been saying, there were no tracks in or out. Here's some big news, not seen publicly before. This is the first time publicly we can tell you from an eminent scientist in Czechoslovakia that the phenomena, as you can see the distribution, has covered the whole of their country. The next photograph will show you of what has come as a tremendous surprise to us, that it's already evolved over the last few years. This is the country now just put back into the corner. These are the patterns that appeared, some of them, in 1994, having run through the same phase, the circles, the single rings, those with tells, dumbbells. This is the guy that I saw in 1983 in southern England, the Celtic crosses, the arrows, the Mars, the Mel symbol. and so on, into your more complex pictogram. This pattern here might be extremely significant. I'm sure they, of course, all are in their own way. But I can tell you that in 1993, a team of researchers, some of them directly working with myself and working with people who provide us mathematics from Dick Hoagland's Mars project, Carlotto, and Professor Hawkins down in Washington, looking at some of the geometries of patterns, they devised a formula and a working model that if this phenomena was attempting to communicate to us alphanumeric form through patterns, that we could insert into the fields a pattern devised mathematically, they would respond to a pattern built, constructed to this formula. If we missed one component part of it, perhaps they would infill it for us, they, the circle makers. Well, the pattern which was placed into the field, and which we had no response from, in southern England in 1993, turned up here in Czechoslovakia in 1994. Now that obviously requires, we need to know exactly where the alignments and all the rest of the grids, there's a lot of work to be done. This arrived only 4 days ago, and you have it to consider. So you've had a spread, and that's a small spread, of where these things are actually appearing. It is a global phenomenon. This is not at all peculiar to southern England. This, believe it or not, it demonstrates 96% of the global total of reports investigated, the patterns are referencing to ground features in such a manner the source knows what's on the ground. It has optical appreciation because it's referencing to either colour, to the boundary of the field, to a tractor tire mark, to vegetation colours changes themselves. This is just an example of where the farmer has applied a higher level of nitrogen, chemical nitrogen, the process is fully understood, to the boundary of the field, caused the plants to be nutritionally different to the remainder of the field, and has caused a boundary change that can be seen in the colour of the plants from the air. From the ground, it's very difficult to see these subtle changes. The aerial photograph is very clearly evident that the boundary is there. Well, the phenomenon occurs, a type 2 pattern, which has arrived many, many times, has dead-centered, plant perfect, 3 millimeters, perfect, centered upon the boundary change, and its neighbor nearby, as its circumference is butted up precisely to the color change. Freddie's infrared photograph, which is what we're looking at here, shows also this, what we are at this point assuming to be an underground archaeological contour site, centers exactly to this pattern. This is not evident either from the ground level. This is an infrared photograph showing that this complex pattern has not just randomly located itself, it's referenced to a feature precisely. Once again, this beautiful, hot air balloon it reminds me of, but this sort of pattern in infrared again with Freddie's photograph, you might think, well, excuse me, it really isn't referencing to these tractor tire marks. No, it isn't. Here we have watershed, a watershed contour, which is running through here, and something else we can't explain at the moment. We now have the photograph, the result. This can be checked out next year. This line running down here, and where these two contours meet or collide, or whatever, the pattern itself appears to have grown. Referencing, referencing, referencing. I'm seeing it in virtually everything I look at. Here, this one might not be totally obvious immediately, but once again, the military, the British Army, did some work on this before the cooperation and links, communication channels appeared to be severed. But prior to that time, they confirmed to me that my aerial shot here indeed was proved by their own mathematics, by their own aerial surveillance, that this major axis running through this beautiful pattern was precisely parallel to the colour change here, the boundary of the field between the light grey and the brown. And indeed, these forks, these fingers that form part of the pattern, were exactly at right angles to one another. And the more simple way, of course, is that they simply will reference to the tractor tyre marks themselves. That's very simple, and it literally shares the same axis, the pattern, and the man-made feature of the tractor tyre mark. And if I can throw in without appearing to try and steer you, and please, I'd go away unhappy if I thought I'd actually steered you. I simply want to communicate to you information. But I want to say that why not, if one is looking at a subtle shifting of consciousness, a shifting of our thinking, a broadening of our thinking, why not simply, first of all, focus our attention upon our environment, the location in which the patterns appear. It will question us, of course, as to the energies deployed and the reasoning for them appearing. And what better medium to use than something that we put there and we can see, which are the tractor tyre marks. And the handshake surely would be, if we can prove these patterns hold features that cannot be constructed by human beings, and they are certainly something else, and that something else is using the man-made tyre marks, isn't that shaking your hand? Isn't that you did this and you know you did it, and something else did this? Isn't that shaking your hand? Theories. They are primarily those that you're seeing here. The whirlwinds, plasma vortex, underground archaeological sites, they're caused by chemical application, earth energies, hoaxes, for sure. Extraterrestrial, spiritual, the God force, military, space experimentation. That's a whirlwind, and it is causing considerable damage as it moves laterally. That's caused by, the mechanics involved, required for the construction and the support of a meteorological phenomenon of this kind are totally understood in the lee of a hill and the thermal effect during the daylight hours. Well, maybe the British government didn't quite think this through, because they appear in the lee and the low pressure side of a hill. Many of these things in Australia, in your country, and indeed in mine, are appearing where there are no hills. The other kind of whirlwind is formed a thermal effect between daytime temperatures and during daylight hours, the thermal whirlwind. These things, 90%, are appearing, at least 90%, at night. That doesn't sound too good for the whirlwind theory. The question has been raised, is there a process involving collective mind processes that could in some way be instrumental? It isn't an easy one to answer, but it's certainly, I think, these things are not being formed by a collective ceremony of this kind being executed, if you will, by the Druids near Stonehenge. Well, I don't want to say too much more. These are the two guys, Doug and Dave. They are the men that certainly put the research back 10 years without any doubt on that Monday morning in August, was it 91? I ought to remember it to the day, to the hour. But these two guys certainly put the research back very, very significantly. But we have learned by this, I hope. And that, for you to view and to contemplate, is indeed a circle that Pat Delgado and myself challenged Doug and Dave to make in front of national television, and you didn't see that either. You saw, and I saw it again on Sightings, I believe, that last week, the program we did for them had just gone out. They did a clip of showing Doug and Dave pushing these plants down. It would have been great had they shown the final result. These things have no spiral symmetry, they are badly damaged, they have no well-defined cut-off edges. This is a hoax. Ministry of Defence in Great Britain are monitoring, of course, the crop circle phenomena. This is a photograph that I took, just happened to be at the right place at the right time. And something which is really quite significant too, is that whilst proving, of course, on film that these guys are photographing this, there was cooperation at that time. The pilot was traced. I got into a system where I was able to trace him. His photographs were provided, which we have in our database. And what it shows, think about this. This circle here, when this guy is heading out onto a NATO exercise, He wasn't told to go here, at least that's the story. He went on to a NATO exercise, and on his way by, he saw these circles. He took the photographs, which we were pleased about, and if he hadn't done, I was about to, as you can see. But he took a photograph, and this photograph, showing the spiral to be anti-clockwise. 7 hours later, returning from the same military NATO exercise and taking another set of photographs, the circle had reversed its flow. This is bizarre. This phenomena, whatever it is, revisited, reversed, and the military have the evidence. And so do I. The evolution. How has this thing evolved over time? Well, the sizes have increased dramatically, up as you have seen, from half a metre to half a mile. The nearest we have been able to get in England to the Nazca Plain in Peru. I mean, this thing is vast, half a mile across. The densities have increased, the complexity has increased. This is the pattern that I saw in 1983, the very conventional, traditional Celtic cross. Spiritual symbol, but let's just hold it there. That's a fact. This is where the snowflake froze, if you like, on that May Day 1990, when suddenly two circles were connected by a shouldered pathway. That was the beginning. This very pattern was the beginning worldwide of the patterns becoming much more complex. From May 1990, something happened. This, within just a few days, and it's one that I know you have seen, even if you've forgotten, did hit your national television, and we did much of it from England at the time, when a German TV crew found this during the early hours. This is a major pattern, hundreds of feet long, appearing once again during a short night. Not just one, but another two, almost identical. This symbol meant a lot to the indigenous people. It was sent and given to Thomas Binyaka, the Hopi elder in this country, and his thinking, his words, and those indeed from people that were shown shortly after, the Aborigine people and other Native Americans as well. And the term "Mother Is Crying" came out of this particular pattern. It's an Iraqi symbol, coincidence or not. It appeared the very day that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and set light to what I would call the mother's blood. The referencing that we've been talking about. Any there? Well, unless you perhaps are aware of a little bit more than I can show you on the photograph, but enough so I think to make my point, absolutely. This shape, the pentagon, is referenced to about the only pentagon-shaped field cluster I could certainly steer you to in the whole of my country, in the only field available to the phenomenon at the end of the growing season 3 years ago. This mandala appeared in a field referenced to, indeed, a pentagon-shaped field boundary. This one to this, this to this, that to that. And what you can't see outside of the aircraft shot, this particular shot, which of course we have, are the other two boundaries. And that field comes down like that. Bang, bang, bang. Hoaxed? I doubt it. This is the photograph that NASA are now using for these promoting of funds for the space program, the future US space program. And isn't it a beautiful pattern, if whatever else I've got wrong? It's a beautiful pattern, that's for sure. It appeared, this is the one that appeared close to Avebury last year. The internal elements here, it must be, if we're looking at the transfer of information, even if it's people making patterns, it's information. And the information, these standing circles and crescent and rings, is part of the phenomenon. It is not involved, they've not been collapsed, so it's information. We now know that the farmer who owns this field was approached by a person, offered a large sum of money to remove the contents, not the pattern, to remove the contents. Have a look at the next photograph, which was taken from our aircraft 1 day later. Bizarre. The farmer paid money to go into this field, and shed the contents. The board, the information board, was wiped out. But, surprise, surprise, because the circle makers provided us with another one, 8 miles down the road. And this one they didn't get to before we had secured the information. This is a transcendental logarithmic curve. Now, for the architects amongst us, you will know this is not easy. The only way you could approximate these curves in a field anywhere else without sitting in front of a drawing board would be to approximate many, many circumferences by many, many centers. It's a milling machine effect. It's a process of obtaining this shape. But this is an accurate logarithmic curve which would be extremely difficult to execute. I took hours to draw this thing on the computer. This appeared nearly 200 feet across in the fields of southern England, not once, but twice. And then we entered that phase where these were highly suggestive of insects. Beetles, bees, fishes, dolphins, spiders. We've had them all. Isn't that gorgeous? Nestled crescents. Now, the engineers amongst us might, as Professor Hawkins in Washington has been wondering too, is this more than communication in language? Is this the conveyance of technical information? Well, this is a symmetrically rotational pattern. In other words, when you rotate it, there are a number of positions where it's repeated. It's the same pattern whether it's rotated. When it's rotated, I beg your pardon. If you select a position on the edge of that crescent, imagine this is a piece of paper and you've drawn it out, push your pencil lead through and set one spot. Rotate that crescent inside the ring as if it had teeth, gear teeth around it, so that it rotates within the ring. And the shape which your pencil will scribe out, this way on this crescent, that way on that crescent, this way on that crescent, is a complex asteroid. That's technical information. You get some idea of scale here. This is actually a fairly small pattern. It repeats several times. A disc with 2 rings marked around its edges. That was unique. Totally unique. We've only had one of them. It gets lots of eyes when we show this in the Asian countries too. I was with Cynthia down in Republic of China, I think nearly 2 years ago now, in Taiwan, and there were absolutely like ahs to the roof when this came out, because every pattern means something different to the individual. You know, one person will see a pattern meaning something that is not what the next person sees it to mean. And of course, this is the dragon. As far as Asia is concerned, this is the dragon. We had no idea about this at all. Flying the aircraft over, and we could see that we were about never to know about it. As we saw the snail-like pattern crawling up the field, as it were, that's the impression that it gives you, towards a fleet of farmers coming in the opposite direction, prepared, and these are harvesters. These guys were about to remove forever this pattern. The farmers in southern England are up to here with this phenomenon. And now you can see the lengths that they will go to. This is before the field is ready for harvesting, prepared to take their harvest through the center of the field to remove the evidence, not so much the evidence, they want to remove the reason why people are invading southern England to see these patterns. And some farmers, of course, at the other end of the spectrum, continuing to be, thank goodness, extremely cooperative. This guy, Mr. Pitts, near Marlborough, came across this pattern, and because he had only hours before rain to harvest, he finished his harvest and left the pattern for research whilst he burnt off the field next door. I think experiences which supported the fact that there was an electromagnetic anomaly here was when BBC Television, interviewing myself and Pat Delgado in a very large crop circle back about 4 years ago, suddenly the television camera, like Chuck's has there, a computer-controlled TV camera, suddenly the red lights were coming on. Just about every circuit, red lights were coming on. The guy just moved his camera into and onto the very edge of the crop circle. That point, which clearly is the boundary between 100% involved and that which doesn't exist as far as the phenomenon is concerned, the standing plants. On come the fault lights, and Pat Delgado, my colleague, who's wearing a microphone almost identical to the one that I've got on here, with the small aerials, a piece of wire out the back, is picking up, and I am hearing in the sound engineer headset that stood right next to me. I've finished my interview, Pat's in the center of the vortex, and suddenly Pat's saying, my God, it's all around me. His hairs are up on his arms, his hairs are up on his head, and at the same time, this 5.2 kilohertz sound, which we've heard and have recorded now several times, is on the headset of the television cameraman. The TV camera was totally destroyed, £60,000 worth, totally destroyed. Now, the German research projects 2 years ago started looking at, with flux gate magnetometers, the electromagnetic distribution in the fields of the crop circles, and discovered that this is a circle with a nearby neighbour, like one you saw earlier, but this time connected by an arcing pathway, that the electromagnetic field had risen above the norm, that being 5 nanotesla, 5 Gauss, up to 40 to 50 nanotesla inside the crop circles, up to 300% above the normal Earth's electromagnetic field in that part of the northern hemisphere. Now, converting that information into the next slide, which is a 3D elevation plot, you have the information and you have the pattern of the crop circle. What a result! And that is just one pattern of which a number have now been completed. Professor Hawkins down in Washington discovered when he was reading Circular Evidence, which was Pat Delgado, my own first book, and it was the only book at that point, the first book that had been written on the subject. Somebody in England sent Professor Hawkins, who decoded Stonehenge, you might remember, eminent astronomer, a copy of the book. He was running through the dimensions we had placed in the book, suddenly realized that in converting those dimensions to musical tones, to frequency, audible frequency, he could see himself playing the harp, which he plays well. Some of you will have seen that this discovery on Sightings a couple of times now. Gerald Hawkins realized that the component parts of the crop circles had a direct relationship, that is, with the diatonic notes in the Western musical scale. He then went on to note that Euclidean theorems were being applied in the crop circles worldwide from the book itself, and that has continued with new information continuing to be supplied to him. Now, when we're talking about theorems, whoever's theorems there are, whether you're into Euclid or not, don't worry about it. I mean, simply just think about this, that unless the ratio of this circle and this ring around it is precise to what is Theorem 2, Euclid Theorem 2, unless that is precise, and remember, Doug and David got to know all this, unless that is precise, when you scribe a tangent from there to there, if it is perfectly correct, that ratio, you will expect to finish up back at your starting point. If it is even the thickness of the lead on your pencil, unless it's sharp when you do this at home tonight, you will find it is impossible. It is extremely, that's not correct. It is extremely hard. It is not easy to accurately scribe these lines, finishing up back where you began. That's with the ratios correct. And of course, they only have to be a small degree, parts of a millimeter, out in radius here or here, to be, of course, impossible. But the crop circle phenomena is complying with a consistent mathematical law. That's even more difficult when you have all of these to complete and still complete it accurately. But these are the ratios we're looking at, and this being theorem 4. That's a piano keyboard, the diatonic, Western diatonic scale. The ratios I've been talking about, if you were to square the area of a circle, like the circle you saw with a single concentric ring, and compare it with the area of the ring around it, the ratio which exists between the inside and the outside, the circle and the ring, is exactly the same mathematical ratio, relationship, that exists between an audible frequency when you press C on the Western musical scale at 264 Hertz and the adjacent note of 297 Hertz. The same ratio exists. If that is true worldwide, then we have before us a code capable of decoding, because an alphanumeric value can be placed to the 4 octaves on a keyboard. SETI, with your money, have been looking for a single radio frequency for 10 or more years. As they were looking up into the sky for single frequencies, on the ground appeared a single ratio. It was always considered by the scientists at SETI, and we have direct lines in of it for information on this, that if and when, I think when is much more accurately the term, a frequency, the frequency they've been looking for, arrived and was interacted with, then a whole array of frequencies would arrive within which was the capability of decoding and therefore one-to-one communication. When we started to interfere, if you will, by placing formulas in the fields of South England, a whole series of ratios arrived. Analogy, whilst SETI were looking up into the sky for sound frequency, on the ground appeared precisely what they were looking for in patterns. That's an analogy. Well, we've been looking at measuring the brain waves of people inside the crop circles because dowsers claimed they, with their dowsing rod, they were able to detect, had responses with their rods, which, when other dowsers were brought into the process, confirmed indeed that they were detecting something. Didn't know what it was, but the rods would move when they walked over the circumference of the circle. It would twing one way or the other 7 times into the center of the circle consistently. So there was a fixed pattern, a dowsable pattern. What was it they were detecting? People were becoming either elated in crop circles or were feeling ill. I've been in 2,500 myself, and rarely indeed do I feel sick. It has been so, where I have left 1 or 2 early because of the nauseous, but I usually feel perfectly the opposite. We had people from different schools, as it were. We went for a field that we might call those that believed and those that didn't believe in basically anything. Okay, so we measured their brainwave activity and we looked very closely at the dowsing response. It was at this point the fun began. In entering, and this has been going on for some years, this will not be new to some of you. At this point, measured, not only are the rods moving in the direction of the swirl, there is actually a recordable measurement on the equipment itself. On the right hemisphere of the brain, activation, or at least measurable activity across alpha, beta, theta, and delta, at this precise moment, the rods were moving. First time, we think, still to be developed, that science can support the fact there is indeed a physiological effect, a real physical effect, when those rods move in the brain of the human being concerned. Dowsing is a tool that's been used for many years. It's a valuable tool, and when perhaps we start to have more confidence in ourselves, know who we are, we will have more answers. When it came to meditating, now here of course is a magical state where most of the major inventors of our age dreamt, in many cases, the invention which allowed us to be sat here today in many cases, electricity and so on. This has come frequently from the alpha state, that magical state of meditation, that black screen, that zero feeling. It's hard to achieve, these days, let alone, of course, in a busy city. But if you can obtain that state, you transmit alpha waves. This is the result. It's actually simply as brain being measured here. We measure others. At the center of this particular circle, the most effective maintaining of the alpha state, and indeed the inventor, I'm not sure whether Masahiro is here, we were hoping perhaps certainly that he might be, the alpha state maintained in a way that he has rarely seen since he developed his machine right here. And so therefore, my point in showing this is that when people say that they feel elated, very relaxed, something very beautiful about these things, not to be laughed at, because the science supports that this is a state of mind which is achievable and maintainable more easily, it would seem, here than outside. So there's something perhaps much more special about the residual effect after the creation of these beautiful patterns than we might be giving justice to the people who make those claims. These are patterns we recognize. This is a Celtic cross. That is, of course, the traditional Celtic cross. The first one appeared in the crop circles. That's a religious symbol. This is a very ancient symbol which is found around the basin, the Pacific Basin, thought to come from the mythical Mu, the continent of Mu. That is what it is, where it is thought to come from. I think it is something like 27,000 years old. It is precisely the pattern, this, that you saw in that field surrounded by the pentagon contours of that field. It's the same pattern. This, I think you will recognize too. It is indeed the international symbol for the disabled. And because the information, I have to say, if there's a trend in the meaning of the information being conveyed, I would have to say at this point that we are perhaps having our attention drawn to disabling ourselves through our mode of thinking and through our activities. This appeared in a field at the press conference on Thursday when national television had available to them a film with a little white disc moving in this field, arcing around here, returning to a crop circle as if it were observing perhaps, monitoring perhaps, the circle itself moving away from the camera position up into the sky. That was made available to national television Thursday, and of course will not be shown. The year after that, at the point at which this arc was completed by this little object, this appeared. The computer tells us, in looking at 18,000 combinations of known script on our planet, that this is Latin for Apono Astos. Some of you will be perhaps wondering, whatever does Apono Astos mean? Well, it's Latin for we oppose cunning and deception. Extremely timely, as this indeed was the time when the hoaxers were throwing the glass around our diamonds. That's exactly what was happening when this appeared. Well, that is a hoax. Thank God. Worrying, though, isn't it? Because not only is it extremely well executed, it is true that the plants are damaged. They're not changed at the cellular anatomic level. It is true. But it teaches us that as we continue to provide the information, so the hoaxing fraternity are fine-tuning and improving their application.
Was that done over one night?
Yes, indeed it was. Yeah, it was I guess it's funny also. It was put into a field, as you can see, alongside the A272 major highway in southern England, where the Tour de France was to cycle past the following day. And so there was a point being made. But we have learned by it, and I think it's important to put it there for you. I simply now would just like to draw to your attention and for you to consider that we have been somewhat in the hands of about 70 eyewitnesses who have had their eyes where I would have paid great sums of money to have had cameras in the last few years. When I was asked to do the presentation for the SEED group up the road at the United Nations 3 years ago, I was asked by Mohammed Ramadan there to reinvestigate some of those 70 eyewitnesses. These are people, if we can accept their information, who have seen these circles form. Well, we have, for example, a lady walking a dog in British Columbia heard a loud bang, an airburst and an air bang. There was oscillation in the long grass she was walking her dog in, and she watched those plants oscillating in this approximately circular area. And suddenly from the center outwards, the plants were spiraled and collapsed in about 15 seconds. A man called Ray Barnes in 1982, he was walking his dog. A thunderstorm was still moving away into the distance, safe for him to get out with his dog, and that he did. He saw what he describes as a straight line of contact, point contact with cereal crops, nothing visible, not a UFO in the sky, nothing else he could see, apart from the plants bobbing as this straight line passed over the top of them. Just like my laser pointer, about 70 feet long. It missed the plant contact, in other words, it lost plant contact where there was a drop in the land, and re-established as the valley rose the other side. And so this line was now re-established, moving across and slightly towards him, getting closer all the time. It then pivoted around one end. He heard a buzzing sound start. Plants began to oscillate. Now we're back to British Columbia, and down went a circle. He says, I'll give it no more than 10 seconds, and it was there. Mary Freeman, the young lady driving her car down the Avenue of Stones near Avebury on the 15th of July, 1988, and saw a huge golden ball of light in cloud cover above. A beam of light, a white beam of light, cut through the dark sky into a field absolutely at the foot of Silbury Hill, the little battery cell that I was referring to earlier, and the first huge quintuplet set in that area to appear arrived within 48 hours of that particular event. A man who lives in the very field in which that occurred, near Silbury Hill, Chris Goodenough, on the 30th of June 1989, had an argument with his girlfriend who he was living with in that house. He walked out into the back garden to have a cigarette, and he too saw a huge golden ball coming down vertically out of the sky. I wouldn't be stood here telling you this because of my reputation if I did not know these people and spending so much time with them and other witnesses to know I am telling you a truth. This ball of light hitting the ground, bouncing back up, and then retaining its position, getting then much brighter around the periphery, and simply disappearing. This sound has been reported now on 3 or 4 occasions. The skeptics in Great Britain have been telling us that it's a grasshopper warbler bird, which has been picked up on radio frequency, incidentally, too. There are quite some birds in England these days. The sound is 5.2 kilohertz, and you might like to take this into your memory bank for the future. Now that's as heard. Now you're going to hear this slowed down in increments of 50% or so to give you the component parts of the sound. You can hear the 2 actual component parts of that sound right there. Well, obviously life exists itself in patterns. As part of that very wide scene, you may or may not be aware that the remote viewing experiments conducted by the US government since the early 80s, and in recent times conducted through SciTech and Ed Daines with the CIA, was particularly inspired. This I have from first, I was with Ed Daines in Dusseldorf, Germany, less than 10 days ago. And he told me personally that some of the fine-tuning of the remote viewing processes conducted by the US government were inspired by the crop circle patterns seen on television, some of my work as it happens, back in England some years ago. 400 individual modalities that invoked by patterns that permit remote viewing processes to obtain specific information for intelligence in this country are invoked through patterns. Saddam Hussein, you may have seen some of this on recent television, and Colonel Gaddafi's movements and locations were sought and obtained via remote viewing processes by the CIA. The biological weapons that they were trying to locate Saddam Hussein, they were worried had, were located within 500 yards by such processes. And you may also know that they have conducted work to discover some of Dick Hoagland's claims on the underground features on Mars, and why the Russian Phobos mission was terminated mysteriously, and the recent US mission to Mars also terminated mysteriously. The crop circles also have been the center of some of their work, and he has told me personally that the crop circles are not for us, but they are for the extraterrestrials. That's come from Ed Daines of SciTech, working with the CIA and for the US government. I have seen a mystery which was new to the world grow. I've seen the people problems grow with it, and I've seen the media response. I've stood back when I've had the opportunity to stand back. It's been too often basically in front of those cameras, and I've watched how this has been dealt with. This has been one hell of an opportunity, and I've learned by it. And let me tell you, nobody will stop us attempting to put the information to the people as this grows.